Hello, everyone. Welcome to Translation Talks, where past Griffin Poetry Prize winners and finalists discuss their craft and the relationship between translation and poetry. My name is Adriana Onitza, and I'm the editorial director at the Griffin Poetry Prize. And joining me tonight is my wonderful co-host and colleague, Medjin Matherin, along with our esteemed guests, George McWhirter and Emilie Moorhouse. So we're very excited that you're all here. So first off, a big thank you, merci, gracias, to each of you for making the time to be here and to learn from these wonderful Canadian poets and translators. And if you're tuning in, you're likely passionate already about poetry, translation, or both. So before we dive in, here's a little background on the Griffin Poetry Prize. Founded in Toronto, Canada, the Griffin Poetry Prize has its roots on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We mention this first and foremost to highlight our deep respect for these lands, their languages, and the people who have nurtured them for generations. And we'd also like to hear where you're joining us from. So please use the chat to share your city, territory, or nation. And if you're a poet or translator yourself, let us know. This is a wonderful opportunity to build community among people who share a love for world literature. So now to share a little bit more about the prize, the Griffin Poetry Prize is one of the few international awards celebrating poetry written in or translated into English. And over the past 2 decades, we've recognized 30 translated collections on our long lists and our short lists, with 5 translations even winning the prize, including this year, in 2024. George McWhirter, who's here with us today, won this year's Griffin Poetry Prize alongside Mexican poet Homero Aridjis for his translation of Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence. What a beautiful title, it gets me every time. Published by New Directions. Born in Northern Ireland, George is a professor emeritus at the School of Creative Writing of UBC, and he was also Vancouver's first Poet Laureate. Aside from Homero Aridjis, he has translated works by Mario Arregui, Carlos Fuentes, and Jose Emilio Pacheco. And we also have Emilie Moorhouse with us here today, who is longlisted for this year's prize for Emerald Wounds, Selected Poems of Joyce Mansour, who was a Syrian/Egyptian/English surrealist poet who chose to write exclusively in French. And Emilie translated her poetry into English. Emilie holds an MFA from the University of British Columbia, and raised in a French-speaking household in Toronto, she now lives in Montreal, where she works as a teacher, writer, translator, and environmentalist. So thank you, George and Emilie, for joining us for our 6th Translation Talks and for sharing your insights today. I'd like to invite you, George, to start off our event by reading an excerpt of your translation of Homero's poetry, followed by Emilie, who will read a poem she translated by Joyce Mansour.
El deseo de ser uno mismo. Desde Kafka. Si uno pudiera ser un jinete, cabalgando a pelo sobre un caballo transparente, a través de vientos y de lluvias, constantemente sacudido por la velocidad de la cabalgadura. Si uno pudiera cabalgar intensamente hasta arrojar lejos de sí las ropas, porque no hacen falta las ropas, hasta deshacerse de las riendas. ¿Por qué no hacen falta las riendas? Hasta arrojar lejos de sí la sombra, porque no hace falta la sombra. Y si viera y así. Tierra que el campo no es campo, sino puñado de aire. Si uno pudiera arrojar lejos de sí el caballo y cabalgar solo sobre sí mismo. So, anyway, quite dramatic. The desire to be one's self. After Kafka. If you could be a horseman riding bareback through the winds and rain on a transparent horse, constantly buffeted by the velocity of your mount, if you could ride hard until your clothes were cast off far behind you, because there is no need of clothes, until reins were done with, because there is no need of reins, until your shadow was cast far behind you, because there's no need of a shadow. And then you might see countryside not as countryside, but a fistful of air, if only you could cast the horse far behind and ride on yourself.
Beautiful. Thank you, George.
Okay. Le soleil dans le Capricorne. 3 jours de repos. Pourquoi pas la tombe? J'étouffe sans ta bouche. L'attente déforme l'aube prochaine et les longues heures de l'escalier sentent le gaz. À plat ventre, j'attends demain. Je vois luire ta peau dans la grande trouée de la nuit, le balancement lent d'un beau clair de lune sur la mer intérieure de mon sexe. Poussière sur poussière, marteau sur matelas, soleil sur tambour de plomb. Toujours souriant, ta main tonne l'indifférence. Cruellement vêtue, inclinée vers le vide, tu dis non. Et le plus petit objet qu'abrite un corps de femme courbe l'échine. Nice artificielle, parfum factice de l'heure sur le canapé. Pour quelle pâle girafe ai-je délaissé Byzance? La solitude pue. Une pierre de lune dans un cadre ovale, encore une insomnie aux jointures rigides, encore un poignard palpitant sous la pluie, diamant et délire du souvenir de demain, sueur de taffetas, plage sans abri, démence de ma chair égarée. Sun in Capricorn. 3 days of rest. Why not the tomb? I can't breathe without your mouth. The weight warps the coming dawn, and the staircase's long hours smell of gas. Flat on my stomach, I wait for tomorrow. I see your skin gleam in the great breach of the night. The slow sway of fine moonlight on the inland sea of my sex. Dust on dust, hammer on mattress, sun on beating drum. Still smiling, your hand thunders indifference. Dressed cruelly, tilted towards emptiness, you say no. And the smallest object housed in a woman's body arches the spine. Artificial niece, false perfume from the hour on the couch. For what pale giraffes have I abandoned Byzantium? Loneliness sucks. A moonstone in an oval frame, yet another insomnia with rigid joints, yet another dagger pulsing under the rain. Diamonds and deliriums of tomorrow's memories. Taffeta sweat, homeless beaches. Madness of my flesh gone astray.
Beautiful. Thank you so much to you both for those beautiful readings. To begin, we'd love to know what was the first thing that sparked your interest translating these poets?
First of all, what attracted me was that, I'll quote someone, Victor Manuel Mendiola. He said, la enfermedad de Latinoamérica es la abstracción. Y de Norteamérica, confesión. So one of the things that attracted me to Homero, as the same thing attracted me to Jose Emilio Pacheco, was that they weren't abstract. They were very real. And Homero wrote about when I was living in Mexico in 1975 and going up to work with Jose Emilio Pacheco in Mexico City. Homero and Jose Emilio wrote about everything I saw around me. And that was very important. In the case of Homero, oh my God, you just see it from this poem. He was a lot more dramatic than Jose Emilio. And he adopted various persona. He would, people from the street, people high up. He would make fun of politicians. He would make fun of the gods and make terribly terrifying poems about the gods. He'd write about dogs. I love dogs. So all of the kinds of things he wrote about, I loved as well. And that was what drew me to him. Actually, the first book I saw, I'll hold it up, is Does It Come Round? Quemar las Naves. That was in 1975. And that book, I would have loved to translate that book, except Elliot Weinberger was translating it, and he was Homero's translator at that time. So I had to wait, over 20 years to start translating Homero.
I love that. Yeah, thank you for sharing. What about you, Emilie?
Yeah, when I first came upon Mansour's work, I think the first thing that sort of really struck me was, I guess, the sort of diversity of emotion in her poetry. How there's a kind of revolt in what she's saying, but she's also she goes from being angry to being vulnerable to being sad to like sort of this dark humor. So I think sort of that sort of huge variety in her tone, in her poems, but that ultimately she is in revolt, right? And so I think that sort of counter narrative voice, like a really, really powerful voice that is in revolt, that is rejecting standard narratives, and that is turning things on their head and sort of reversing them. Obviously very cleverly done way. I think that for me was it was surprising. Sometimes it makes you uncomfortable, but I just couldn't sort of look away in a way. For me, I wanted to discover more about who she was. And I think the fact also that, she was like a prominent member of the Surrealist group, and myself having been educated under the French educational system, being familiar with Surrealists, but really never having heard her name, that also intrigued me further. I was like, why is this person not so well known when her voice, I think, more than ever is relevant now? And what she was saying really, really resonated when I discovered her, and I think it absolutely still does. I think it's a very sort of contemporary voice. She speaks to a lot of issues that are still present today, that resonate with women, that with gender roles, and so that was something that I really connected with in her work, but also the fact that she just wasn't very well known, or like barely known, right? Especially in the Anglophone world, and actually also in France. So that was something that drew me to her almost immediately.
Yeah, in the Rumpus, you mentioned that after a translation course in 2017, you actively sought out to translate a woman writer who was controversial, someone the literary establishment didn't approve of. So we're actually curious to hear from both of you. I mean, you kind of mentioned it a little bit already, just around what drew you, but can you share more around what aspects of their voices spoke to you the most and made you feel their words needed to reach a wider audience through the English language?
Well, I suppose the attitude to Latin American poetry and Spanish poetry is that it's so surreal, so other, that it's not accessible. And one of the things I thought very important about Homero and Jose Emilio, also another poet I translate, Gabriel Zaid, they're accessible. You can see what's happening in the poems. You can feel what's there. You can respond directly to what's in the poem. You're not lost wondering, where are you? Where's this happening? Is this in outer space or is it in Mexico? Well, in Homero's case, it's not outer space. It's Mexico. It's right there. What I particularly like, one of the poems in Self-Portrait, in the Zone of Silence, is about a table dancer, Lupe Bellet. And Homero assumes her voice. And I loved it because it had tough, rotty street language. And this was one of the other things that came across to me, because I grew up in a rough district, right, in Belfast. So things like that, the roughness, that he could project, and the fact that he could assume a tough woman's voice really appealed to me. And those were voices that, like Lupe Bellet, that needed to be heard. At the end of the poem, she curses the bureaucracy, where they're always away from their desks. And it's a wonderful poem. It's a grouch.
I guess if I can just come back to the Rumpus article that you mentioned, in that I I explained that that when I came across her work, I was looking for someone to translate, and it was right around that time that the sort of Me Too movement went viral. And so at the time, it was about women's voices, women's desires, right? And especially in the context of the cultural industry. And so that's where I was like, okay, I really need to find a voice who is sort of speaking her truth. And regardless of what society's expectations of her, right? So I wanted a woman's voice, and someone who kind of defied societal sort of expectations, limitations, who didn't fit the mold, right? And was in fact kind of breaking the mold. And I think that's what I found in her. It was, she was exactly what I was looking for. And I think, she was writing these things in the 50s, which I found, 1950s. Her first collection of poems came out when she was still living in Egypt. She was kind of part of the high society in Egypt. So she would be received she would go to receptions with the king of Egypt, right? So she was like clearly, like there was she was speaking her truth, right? Because she experienced some very difficult moments in her life. So she was very much uncensored. And that's what I really liked about her, because she wasn't pretending to be anything other than someone who is angry, who is vulnerable, right? All of these things embodied in her poems. And that, I think that rawness was really refreshing for me. Even and also learning about how people reacted to her poems at the time, right? A lot of people were kind of pushing back on her and saying, well, you should just write about, the flowers and the bees. And so she then found sort of reception with the surrealists in France. So I think it was like really connecting with her work, and then even discovering more and more about her and about her life and how that's reflected in her work was also a really important path for me.
Yeah, Joyce Mansour and Homero Aridjis each have distinct visceral styles. So how do you approach translating poets with such potent imagery? And do you find that certain techniques better capture their voices? And could you give us a bit of an example maybe of how you solved a particular tricky metaphor or image?
Or image. Oh, let me think about that. If just take the poem I read and look at the end of it. It's a scene with Homero. One of the things is they're almost like movies. There's action in them, and there's a scene. And when you come to the end of it, this el deseo de ser uno mismo, the desire to be oneself. When you come to the end in Spanish, the literal of that is y cabalgar solo sobre sí mismo, which is to gallop or ride on one's self alone. And for me, that was far, far too slow. So I sped it up with ride on yourself. And the double on with a comma was how I sped it up to the pace of the action. So it's not only matching images. Images are easy, actually, in a way. It's there. You see an image, and when you see an image, you take it to a place where there actually are no words. You can see it, and so you can bring it back into English from that place where there are no words. And I should give you an example from Jose Emilio Pacheco, that I'm a sea addict, right? A saltwater addict. There's a poem. It's a short prose poem, and it's about dawn coming. And in the poem, looking at it, as I looked at it, there's sea, which is making its usual noise, sounding. The word he uses is sounding. And the after that, there is a boat. I would say a boat. In English, he says the boat. And what he says is that literally the boat flounders, flooded with solitude. So it's a lonely, it's overflowing with loneliness. So you could see this, and you could see it in many different words. But the order, for example, of that image, for me, didn't work. It's the wrong way around. The boat flounders, flooded with solitude. For me, in my image logic, and there is image logic, I reverse the line. So it's flooded, taking the literal words, flooded with solitude. A boat flounders. But for me, it goes down too quickly when you say a boat flounders. So to slow the sinking, I say boat. Put it in the present continuous, a boat is floundering. So there's the literal, and there's the image, and there's, as they say with an image, you just see it, and you reenact what is happening in that image of that boat.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear your breakdown of how you came to your translation. Thanks for sharing, Emily.
Yeah, I think as George was saying, images are not particularly difficult to sort of convey or translate, but it's some of the other things that the poet is doing. And in Mansour, what she does a lot is she plays around with the sounds of words, and she kind of, suggests things through certain words. That like are not actually like it's like maybe that word sounds like something that she's suggesting, like maybe like phalène, which is we would translate it in English, but it obviously is similar to like phallus. So right, she'll suggest these things that are in fact very difficult to translate, because our words obviously sound different, and right. So I think some of the ways that I worked around that or worked with that is that maybe in one line, I can't make that suggestion in the line as given, but in the next one I might have that opportunity. Right. So there's sort of one where I'm talking about. She says, taquiner ses penchants avec un blaireau de soie, saupoudrer son phalène de sang et de suie, right? So in the line that sort of precedes the one where she mentions the phalène, which I translated as moth, earlier on I say something like, or I've translated tease his kinks with a silk brush, right? So there's other opportunities to kind of infer or reference what she's referencing. It might not be with the exact word that she's used, but there are other opportunities with another English word that might be nearby, right? The other thing too is that what was interesting about her is that she was actually Anglophone, right? Her first language was English, and then she wrote in French. And so there are some opportunities in there where I feel like she's writing in French, but her English brain is at work almost. And so in the poem that I read, she does say soleil sur tambour de plomb. So in French, there is this expression of tambour de plomb, which would mean blazing sun. And so the way that I translated it was sun on beating drum, as opposed to sort of translating, sun on lead drum, which doesn't really mean anything in English, but sun on beating drum, it's bringing in what I the meaning of that sort of heavy beating sun that is beating down, right? So there are a lot of sort of fun opportunities in her poetry. She's very, very playful with language, which is what actually made translating her a lot of fun, like challenging, but fun as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I also speak French and the English, so I really thoroughly enjoyed the collection in that way, and I could see that. We found that many people are curious about literary translators' relationship to their language. Emily, growing up in a French-speaking household in Toronto and now living in Montreal, how has your relationship and movements between French and English shaped your understanding and practice of translation?
Actually my first language was French, but I grew up in a sort of Anglophone city, Toronto, but I did follow sort of the French educational system in Toronto. And so strangely enough, I went through like, the very strict grammar lessons of like French. Okay. I did a lot of French grammar. That's what I remember. But I'm also of the generation who was not taught grammar in English. And so I actually, and just, I think from having lived in an Anglophone environment in Toronto, I feel more at ease in English, but I also maybe feel more freedom in English, to be more creative than I do in French, because there's so many gatekeepers in the French language that for me, it's like, I feel like I cannot take liberties, as many liberties as maybe I can take in English. But I also kind of make that parallel with Mansour because, right, her first language was English, and then in high school, I think she did some schooling in like a very sort of like in a private boarding school in Switzerland, where they trained them to be like, proper young ladies. And so I see her taking a lot of liberties in the French language. And I almost feel like there's this parallel where she may have felt that kind of freedom to experiment in the French language that I don't feel, but that I feel I'm able to do in English. So I think it has to do, like, our relationship with the language really dictates what we give ourselves permission to do, maybe, is how I see it. It's obviously just something in our minds, because she obviously loved to play around with the French language, and could even bring in some of these sort of like the English mind into the French language, which I don't think I could do in writing in French, even though, I can write in French, but for me, the creative language is English.
That's so interesting, Emilie. And perhaps Mansour, in translating her, will lead to you giving yourself permission to play more with French. Who knows? I'm so excited to hear more about your intersections between poetry and translation. But first, I wanted to ask George, your relationship to Spanish began at 13 when you were given the Oxford Book of Spanish Verse, and you began translating poets like Machado, Alberti, Guillen, and Lorca in school. And you said in an interview with CanLit, I simply fell in love with the Spanish poets, and translating their poems changed from class exercises into a spontaneous routine. So in the 7 decades since those early class exercises, how has your relationship with Spanish and Spanish language poetry evolved? And do you still find yourself falling in love with poetry in Spanish today?
Oh, naturally. If I'm just as much as I'm still in love with the sea and looking at it and turning it into poems, or God help the sea. Anyway, same with Spanish. Jose Emilio has a poem he says, I always return to it, meaning the sea. And the same with Spanish, I return to it. A, for relief from English, and the other reason is, I suppose, temperamentally, there is an affinity between the Irish and the Spanish. Pío Baroja said that los irlandeses son españoles honorarios, they're honorary Spaniards. And to some extent, that's true. We're up, we're down, we're sideways emotionally. And well, to just give you an example of how much I go back, even to those first translations I did, the first one we got was the lament for the Moor who lost Granada. And when I was that young, I couldn't rhyme it. So I've gone back several times, and I've gone back again and rhymed the opening of it. Lament of the Moorish king who lost Granada. There passed the Moorish king through the city of Granada, from the Elvira Gate as far as the Viva Rambla. Ay, for my Alama. Letters came to him of the Alama's fall. He threw the letters in the fire. The messenger he slew. Ay, for my Alama. So I go back to that. Not only did I go back to that, but I end up writing a poem that starts off with that opening. And it's called Lament for the Moor, his king who lost Granada. And it begins down the Thacatin through Viva Rambla to the Elvira Gate. He moves his car. For in the Parador, near the Alhambra's geometric gardens and halls, where every arch is a progression proportional to the one before, this lopsided dame in a saffron cloak with walking stick and hat fit for a prelate approaches with a knee-high maze of box hedge to ask, "Are you the Moor who lost Granada?" Down the Thacatin, through the Viva Rambla to the Elvira Gate, like the barking of dogs at an awful cart, her words pursue him. Arts and culture, agriculture, trade, but no soldiers from among the people to save it, only Christian and Saracen mercenaries paid to guard it. Too civilized to survive were you, scholar, wise one, which I think me a lot. So I have this long stemming from that. So I always go back to.
Mhm. That's beautiful. George, this reminds me of when we reached out to you for advice for emerging poet translators for our Writing Tip Wednesdays on social media. And you really shared that one of the great benefits of translation is its ability to keep your own writing sharp. And you said if inspiration in your own work falters, you can turn to translation to keep your writing tuned up, ready for when that inspiration returns with something you've never tackled before. And I found that super inspiring to me when I had like a writer's block. I went back to those words and I thought, yeah, this translation really kind of refuels writers themselves. So that's really beautiful. The next thing I really wanted to ask, because we always love asking translators about the metaphors they use to ground themselves in the process of translation. So, for example, George, when Ian Williams interviewed you and Homero Aridjis, Homero used the monarch butterfly as a metaphor to describe his relationship to you as his translator. So I'm curious, what metaphor would you use for yourself as a translator? Do you have any specific image that guides how you see your role when moving a text from one language to another?
Metaphor, an image. He said monarch butterflies. He also called, as I mentioned before, asked me doble. I was double in English, right? He said that to Padre Watuma. Now, I suppose, since I'm on the West Coast, the best image I could have is of a sockeye salmon with its gills flared, and it's filtering little photoplankton. And that's a bit like me, filtering the syllables, the words, the images, the lines, the stanzas. So I'm sort of filtering and then embodying them and trying to put them on a plate of a page, right?
Mm. Filtering and embodying, those are really beautiful verbs to describe that work. And Emilie, in your introduction to Emerald Wounds, you beautifully describe translation as re-inhabiting the original process of creation, like, quote, slipping on a piece of clothing the author might have worn. So I'm curious, what did you have to physically or metaphorically slip on to translate Joyce Mansour's work? And how did stepping into like her voice and world shape that approach for you?
Yeah, I think I don't have an object or anything physical of hers that I could that would embody her, but I think for me it was really getting her voice in my head and interpreting it. And I think it is like an actor, right? It's almost like we're translators, we're interpreters, we have these lines, and then we it's almost like acting them out. But for me, I think it was really about having that tone, her voice, her emotion. I think it was really about translating the emotion that comes through in her poems. That for me was what guided my translations the most. It was almost like something I could hear in my head when when I was reading her poetry, and sort of thinking about it in English and how it would sound in English, and just kind of having this. I think it also, the strength in her voice was also a really strong guiding force in how I translated her, to sort of maintain that strength and that sort of how do you say, to sort of have her personality and her voice come through and shine through in the English translation of it. So it was almost, it was like kind of like channeling her spirit in a way, right? She talks a lot about death and life and reincarnation, and it was kind of like, how do we bring her back to life? And so that was really sort of a guiding force in my work with her work.
It's very interesting you say channeling your spirit, because in our last translation talks, Donald Nicholson Smith also talked about that very same thing, almost using those same words. So I love that. So now perhaps we move on to some provocative questions now, because we'd be remiss not to ask about the fact that both of you published your translated collections that either won the Griffin Poetry Prize or were longlisted with American publishers. So New Directions of New York City published Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence, and City Lights in San Francisco published Emerald Wounds. So my provocative question is, why not Canadian publishers? And what led you to publish south of the border? I'm not sure who would like to begin, but I'm very interested about this.
Emilie, do you want to answer that?
Okay, sure, I can begin. I'll start. So, I mean, the publishing process for me was really very organic. It actually, it came from this Rumpus article. I was, at the time and I still am, like, I was so passionate. I was like, I need to, keep writing. I need to get this out there. And so I had written an article, and I had some translations that I just kind of pitched to like every magazine that I could think of that would be interested in. And the Rumpus was the one who picked it up, an American magazine. And then from there, Garrett Caples, with City Lights, he contacted me. He read the article and he contacted me and suggested we make a book together. So there was something that was really very organic about that. And which is like it's wonderful. And I'm very grateful to Garrett for sort of picking that up and sort of, working with me on this book. And, I think it fits very well with also the mission of City Lights, right? It's a very good fit for City Lights, as publishers of surrealists. That being said, I think, I did pitch it to Canadian magazines, and there wasn't really any interest in there. And I think the fact that I'm, and George as well, that we're we're translating authors who are not Canadian, that was very much a factor. Like I think I did contact some publishers in Canada and was told that, the author that I'm translating is not Canadian. And so the priority of Canadian publishers is to publish translations of Canadian writers or Canadian poets. So that's sort of been my experience, which yeah, I'd love to hear what George has to say.
Yeah, it's interesting that Garrett picked up the rumpus and saw that you had Mansour there, and it would be a fit for City Lights. I worked with Garrett on Homero's Poemas Solares, solar poems with City Lights. And Garrett's he's a terrific fella. He is. Anyway, but it's the same sort of thing. No Canadian publisher wants other than, you put it exactly, wants other than Canadian poets, largely French, or it could be other languages, but they have to be Canadian. And that's for grants, particularly Canada Council grants. So money talks. There is only VQ Press, maybe the only one that's in Montreal that would look at other poets from other places. I think Jenny Gunn, who translates Dasha Maraini from Italian. Dasha Maraini was Alberto Moravia's squeeze, as somebody put it. But she's a terrific poet in her own right. And she published, I think, something with VQ Press. But I had a manuscript of Gabriel Zaid sitting for years into oblivion with a couple of publishers. Oh, yeah, they would love to do it, but they held on to the manuscript but never did anything. Okay, so you end up by going to new directions. And contacts are very important, even in the United States. At the time that I sent Jose Emilio Pacheco selected to New Directions, James Laughlin was still there. Now, it just so happens I'm from the north of Ireland, and the Laughlin family, the Laughlin Steel and all that, they were from a little place called Warren Point in County Down. And half of me comes from County Down, the other half from County Antrim. So there was a connection, just like Garrett picking up the rumpus and saying, wow, here's a book that should come out. And by the way, you've done a terrific job in bringing her out of obscurity to readers. Now I know about
Thank
her.
you.
I know her poetry. It's wonderful. Anyway, that's how it goes. You need a contact, even, I think, in the United States. I should say that sometimes the poet you're translating will end up publishing your translations. Gabriel Zaid, who I translate, the latest book that I have that I'm connected to and have a lot of translations into English from are his Poemas Traducidos, which is translated poems. This is the most interesting book. It's this thick. It's number 6 in his cumulative collected that Colegio Nacional puts out. Now, the first part of this book is indigenous clans, tribes, poetry, translated into Spanish. The second part of the book is all the other language poetry that Gabriel has translated. Then after that, it's every translator into every language that Gabrielle's poetry has been translated. So since I translate all this stuff, I'm kind of the principal translator into English. But there are very prominent other, like Elliot Weinberger, who I mentioned, Margaret Randall, probably gone, and etc. in there. And it's a really interesting book for translators and translation. Because you can see what happens to Gabriel when he's translating it to French, etc. He has a big long piece of juvenilia that he won a prize at UNAM, the National University, with, and it rhymes. It's 4 pages of rhyme. I rhymed it like an idiot. The only other person to rhymed it in French. Anyway, it's called Poemas Traducidos. So those of you who are interested, it's out of Mexico City. It's Colegio Nacional. That's the publisher. Very important publisher.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes your poet does it for you.
Thank you so much, both for your candid responses when it comes to navigating CanLit. You know, with George especially, you have such a vast experience mentoring poets and translators at UBC's School of Creative Writing, where you taught for several decades, and also your role as Vancouver's first Poet Laureate. Moving forward, like, how do you see the landscape and the future of CanLit changing or evolving, and what would really need to change, in your opinion, for things to become more inclusive towards translations?
Oh, what can I say? The poetry is of its generation, usually. It moves with the issues and the problems of the generation. And remember I said what Victor Manuel Mendiola, how he said, the problem with North American poetry is confession. Now, a lot of poetry, of course, it is like nonfiction. It's a direct response to things that are there, situations that are there, that are turned into verse and dramatic verse and so on. But like every generation has had its either pandemic or close to pandemic or endemic disease. So you find a lot of poetry will be writing about that. So in one way, nothing changes. It's the same situations that this generation is responding to. In terms of oddities, we used to get beaten over the head for being too surreal at UBC's creative writing in the late 60s. That was also because we had Michael Bullock, who was one of the last English surrealists of the Sir Herbert Reed group. And but they tarred all of us with being totally surreal, whereas we're a wee bit surreal. And schools develop. Schools' language poetry is big at the moment. And it's kind of offshoot, I suppose, of the all of the stirring that went up around when the New American Poetry, Donald Allen's book, came up with all the beat poets and everything in it. And concrete poetry was on the way. Concrete poetry is still there. It's just that what the concrete poetry is about just changes like the times. I don't know if that answers your question. So to make it more international, it needs magazines to publish more translation.
Yes, I love that. Emilie, do you have anything to add to that?
How to make it more international or
more inclusive in general? What has your experience been as an emerging poet translator? Because I know you translate and you also write for TV and your own poetry. So if you could speak a little bit about your own journey, I guess, navigating the Canadian literature landscape, that would be lovely.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things that's been super surprising about this journey, in my translation journey, is obviously how the book was picked up, sort of the publishing story behind it, and then its reception, which has been like, beyond my greatest greatest hopes, in a way. There's been, it was really well covered in actually US literary magazines. Parts of it was reprinted in poetry, in the Paris Review. The New York Review of Books reviewed it. They had some things wrong, so I wrote a follow-up letter, but there was a really interesting sort of discussion, debate, wonderful reception of the book. And unfortunately, in Canada, it was kind of crickets. And I think it might be because I'm translating an author. Yes, it is. I'm translating an author who's not Canadian. But at the same time, we are Canadian, and we are creating. There is in a translation process, it is a creative process. We are poets, we are writers, and bringing in other poets, other writers from different cultures, different countries, that only enriches the Canadian CanLit landscape, right? That's what, I was just thinking, in a world where borders are going up, I think the literary world needs to be breaking them down, and needs to be some of the more, the richer sort of literary movements, they are international, they exchange ideas. And so I think that we need to kind of look at translation as something that brings and contributes to the Canadian landscape, as opposed to not, right? And so I think that's I would love to see that sort of reexamined and reconsidered, and sort of bringing in all the that translators who are bringing in all these voices are more valued, I guess, than what they are currently in Canada, because they are valued, they are valued in the States, and elsewhere. And I'm not seeing that very much in Canada at the moment. And I think that everybody is kind of losing from that. We're so yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Recognition is a big important factor. People like to read about what they know something of, and strange things that they have not heard about, experienced. Why was Donald Trump elected? Because they recoil at the unfamiliar, the strange, and it's a pity. I should give you a little story. Michael Longley said, there's no use trying that here. It's so local and so ingrown. This is in Belfast in the north of Ireland and so on. And I went to a festival, Flat Lake Festival, where Patrick McCabe tried to bring all the Ulster, that's the Old Kingdom Ulster, poets and novelists and short story writers together. And one of the most popular things at that festival was a songwriter, singer, who got up and he strummed a chant for all of the towns on the coast of Ireland. And every time he mentioned a name that somebody came from, they all cheered. That'll give you some idea of the bond between the people and where they are, even in literature.
And this brings us to the next question, which is, what is next for you both as translators and authors?
So I am in the process of looking at doing some more translating of Monseur's work. There's still quite a bit of her work that has never been translated, including prose poems, short stories. So I'm in the process of looking at that, and then also I think I also need to be focusing on my own work, my own poems, and my own writing. Because I know I totally agree with what George said, is that when you need inspiration, translation is such a great avenue to kind of keep writing, continue with the creative process. But I feel like maybe I've gravitated. I have gravitated to it because I love doing it, but I also need to work on my own work as well. Sometimes you can get sucked in, maybe a little too much. I don't know.
Oh,
George?
me? Oh, well, over the course of a lifetime with one woman, Angela, my wife, I have written poems about various things that happened, various places. We went together, and I'm pulling all of those poems together into a book called Espalier. Espalier, where they put an apple tree up against a trellis and we display it like this. Well, this is your espaliered poet. Kind of espaliered, you'd say, by love and habit. Which is stronger, love or habit. But anyway, I'm collecting all those poems together, and in the past, sometimes with poems I've written segues from one poem to the next, something rosier, but with a bit of biff in terms of poetry. But in this case too, I am doing segues to line up where these poems came from, where they happened, and etc. And the dilemmas that went with, for example, getting married and how to make poetry out of that. So anyway, that's one project. I have a whole book of Irish poems because I always go back to Ireland. I have, as I say, these sea poems of Jose Emilio's, and then I have the oddities, which also, but about 15 years ago, we decided no more books. I had too many books. My friend Gabriel Zaid has a book called Los Demasiados Libros, too many books. And that is, in English, the too many books is a direct quote from the Old Testament. Even in those days, there were too many books. So I decided, no more books, no more bloody books. Just send to literary magazines. You probably get more, if you're lucky, more readers in a literary magazine than you would in a book. So I've been sending these poems, these espaliered poems, out to magazines, and then I'm collecting them.
Thank you, George. That sounds very exciting. So before we move into Q&A from our audience, if there are questions, we'd just love you to read another poem or piece to end translation talks today. It can be also a poem of your own or a translation.
Okay. Warm November. Morning taps at the window. A child's rosebud smile, petals, round and soft, breaking the gray of late dawn with her laugh. Outside, the warm November wind tosses about our recurring defeats. Uneasiness leaches into the streets. The strange climate is lost on her as she dips her bits of buttered toast in the runny sunshine of her plate. She coughs, an echo of a larger storm still remembered for its shattered branches. Slipping from her chair now for her morning dance, the floor sprinkled with crumbs of bread and Play-Doh. Tend to the here and now, they say. With a little hand, life invites me to dance. The rest can wait, along with tomorrow.
Anyway, the poem I read was brought to mind by Emilie's book, and so something a bit suggestive. It's called Conchita Supervia Sings. She sees him in a time of pelts, when animals disguise themselves as men and men as animals, the better to deceive their prey. And thus their faces grew alike. This jaguar-jawed young man with furrowed brows and nose, his gaze as reposed as a philosopher's, who metronomes the beat of blood in Conchita Supervia's throat, the swelling vein of disarray in her mezzo aria, an escalating sacrifice that claws at her behind the lethal daze of his attention, his face with the eyes to his mind unmasked, in wait for the tender meat in her hands caress. Around his starched collar and his ears hangs a cape of mink-fine hair, but black as jaguar ink. It leaves a stain on her body and mind, for how impeccably level his eyes are. He has all the time in his life to wait for her last note, the diva with the voice of an inedible bird whose paw craves as its plaything.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you. It really gives me goosebumps to hear you both read. Thank you so much. We will now open up the floor for questions from the audience. So you could raise your hand on Zoom or type your question into the chat and we will call on you. I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much. Gracias, George and Emilie. We're so thrilled that you took the time to share your insights today. As many people are saying in the chat, it was truly inspiring. And for me, it renewed this fire I have inside of me for translation and poetry. So thank you. Are there any questions? Also, Emilie and George, if you have questions for one another, now would be the time also to ask.
Yeah, I think, Emilie, you mentioned switches in mood and also in, I suppose, the way those moods were projected in the language and the lines. And it's, again, well, I don't want to press you for too much of a specific example, but you did give an example. Do you have any others?
Of switch in moods?
Yeah, where she's across a line into the next line, where there's a switch or a change.
Actually, in that same, actually, there's a very distinctive switch in the poem that I did read there. Sorry, not the one that I read, the one that I took an example of with the saupoudrer son phalène. it kind of, she starts off the first part of that poem. It's kind of like dark humor mixed in with sort of like dark magic and witchcraft a little bit. She's like, it's funny. She's also kind of talking about, pissing in her husband's soup. Right. So there's sort of funny aspects there. And then it breaks, and there's like a third sort of pair or stanza that essentially she's still talking about, it's much more serious. It's a much more serious tone. That she says, I do not know hell, but my body has been burning ever since I was born. Right. It's like, it's kind of, there's a switch from kind of this humorous, magical tone, it's still a dark tone, but the humor kind of leaves there. And there's like a darkness and a sadness, right? My pubis too sensitive to the rain, motionless like a mollusk, right? Clings to the telephone and cries, right? So she's, there's like this kind of, I think it's, there's two moods to that. I think this is a point in her poetry where her husband, I think, was like cheating on her. And so there's a mix of anger and sort of like revenge and violence being expressed in there. But then there's also this kind of sadness, so I guess, I don't know if that would sort of answer your question, George, but yeah, she responds to many things in many ways. There's humor, there's sadness, there's rage, which is like a very normal thing, really, isn't it?
All the time.
Yeah, that's right. We don't respond with a single emotion to this, right? To anything, really. We go through many emotions, right?
Thank you so much, Emilie and George. This was very riveting and generative discussion. And thank you, everyone, for coming from Canada, the US, Scotland, Ireland, all over, especially you two exceptional poets and translators. We have recorded this event, and so it will be shared on YouTube as a podcast. And so make sure to follow us on social media at Griffin Poetry for updates on our next translation talks. And our 10-book Griffin Poetry Prize long list will be announced March 19th, 2025. And our 5-book shortlist and Lifetime Recognition Award recipient will be announced April 23rd. And on May 21st, the next Canadian First Book Prize winner will be announced. And on June 4th is the Griffin Poetry Prize readings that will take place in Toronto, where the winner will be announced on stage. And so thank you so much for everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eugene and Adriana.